Now I've got. Sorry, my mail program opened up in the middle of everything. I don't know what that's about. A mail program I never use. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Mukhaṁ karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim jatkripatamaham bande Shri Gurun Dinataranam. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam. Pancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhobhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So this month's series is glimpses into the Mangalacarana verses of Srimad-Bhagavatam. So those are the first 3 verses. We remember from the first chapter of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita that an auspicious invocation of a text includes 3 parts. One is the Namaskar, the Vastu Nirdesha, and the Ashirvad. So the Namaskar is invoking the blessings, offering obeisances to and invoking the blessings of the deity. And it's a not an uncommon thing in world literature to see. One of the conventions I remember from my university days as an English major a million years ago, that in epic poetry around the world, one of the conventions of epic poetry, wherever you have it, is an invocation of the muse, that personality that inspires the author to write a particular text, to write in this case, this particular epic poem. So we see one of the great epic poems of the English language is John Milton's Paradise Lost, about our fall from heaven, or our fall from grace, actually. It includes Satan's fall from heaven, Lucifer's fall from heaven. But it's about humanity's fall from grace and redemption by Jesus Christ. And the muse that's invoked in Paradise Lost is God. If I remember correctly, Milton asks God to inspire him to write. And the purpose, he also gives a purpose. The Vastu Nirdesha shloka tells the purpose generally, kind of like the thesis statement of the text. The thesis statement tells not just the purpose, but the point that the text wants to make. And Milton does that as well. He says that the purpose of his particular poem is to justify the ways of God to man. So, the Vastu Nirdesha shloka, which we'll look at today, which is the second shloka, is the statement generally of the purpose, of the point of the particular text. And then you have the Ashirvad, which is the blessing, which may tell the fruit, the result, the auspicious results of hearing a particular text. And here in the Bhagavatam, we'll see it's almost, we'll see next week, it's almost more of an exhortation that we, it's almost demanding that those who are qualified to hear Srimad-Bhagavatam take full advantage of it and enjoy the auspicious results of hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam now and always. So the Vastu Nirdesha is the statement of the point. But as we'll see, when we look at the Vastu Nirgesha of Srimad-Bhagavatam, it does even more than that. So let's take a look at this first. Oh no, I have to get this stuff out of the way. So this text, just like the first text, this text is written in this wonderful, very active chanda or meter called Shardula Vikreditam, the prancing of the tiger or something like that. So this is a long meter, if I remember correctly. Shardula Vikreditam is a 17-syllable meter, which means there are 17 meters to a pada, a half line of the text. And we could read it. The chanda lends itself to the tune with which we sing another Shardula Vikreditam song familiar to us, which is Srinivasacharya's prayers to the six Goswamis. However, I'm not going to do that. I have another way that I usually chant this verse. So the verse goes, Dharma projita kaitavotra paramo nirmat saranam satam vedyam vastavamatra vastu shivadam tapatrayun mulanam Srimad-Bhagavate mahamuni kute kingva parairishvara sadyo hridya varubhyate trakutabi sushushabhistakshanat. So Srila Prabhupada's translation, which is probably quite familiar to many of us. Completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated, this Bhagavat Purana propounds the highest truth, which is understandable by those devotees who are fully pure in heart. The highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. Such truth uproots the threefold miseries. This beautiful Bhagavatam, compiled by the great sage Vyasadeva in his maturity, is sufficient in itself for God realization. What is the need of any other scripture? As soon as one attentively and submissively hears the message of the Bhagavatam, this culture of knowledge of the Supreme Lord is established within his heart. So we see in this second part of the verse, we see the purpose of the text. The explicit purpose of the text of Srimad-Bhagavat Purana is God realization, is the ultimate welfare of all beings, which coincidentally, well, as part of that welfare, as part of bestowing that welfare, uproots the threefold miseries. So we can take a minute to remind ourselves of these threefold miseries, since they're referred to explicitly in the verse. Tapatraya unmulanam, the uprooting of these threefold miseries. So the threefold miseries that Sanatana Goswami asked famously, who am I and why do I suffer these threefold miseries? Kayami, who am I? And then why am I suffering these tapatraya, these three kinds of suffering? So we have adhyatmika, adhidaivika, and adhipautika. So the adhyatmika tapa, the adhyatmika miseries are those caused by our own self, caused by our mind or our own body. And then the adhidaivika, we think of those as being caused by they're called adhidaivika because we think of them as being caused by the devatas, by the gods. These are things like natural disasters that are beyond our control. It's too hot, it's too cold, it's hurricane season, or there's a blizzard, and all the trees have fallen. They've gotten so heavy with snow that they've fallen across the power lines, and we're freezing in our homes. These are these things that are beyond our control. And adhibhautika, these are the sufferings that are caused by other living entities. The guy who cuts us off in traffic, the old lady with her coin purse, paying for her shopping cart full of groceries with coins from her little coin purse, which makes the line behind her take forever. Things like that. The guy who accosts us, as we're crossing the street, because there's something that about us that person doesn't like. So the Bhagavatam, its purpose is not to uproot the threefold miseries, but hearing it naturally does. It's a natural consequence. So this is definitely for everyone's benefit. But it does even more than that. The more qualified the audience is, the greater the benefits of hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam. And that is that this text in itself, this text alone, is all we need to actually realize our relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the Srimad-Bhagavatam, we'll find Abhidheya Gyan, which is knowledge of our relationship with God and the relationships among the Lord and his various energies, but more specifically, our relationship with the Godhead. I'm sorry, that's Sambandha Gyan. Sambandha Gyan is understanding our relationship with God. And then Abhidheya Gyan is how we activate or realize that relationship, the practice by which we learn that relationship. And then Prayojana Gyan, which is knowing the fruit, the goal, the ultimate goal of that practice, which is Krishna Prema, Prem Prayojana, right? The Panchama Purushartha. And we're going to take a look at those Purusharthas in just a moment. So this is the Bhagavatam's purpose. The Bhagavatam's purpose is to cleanse, completely cleanse our hearts, systematically and progressively cleanse our hearts so that we can realize our relationship with God. We can see God face to face. And we have so many instances throughout the Bhagavatam. We're just reading one here at our center here in Honolulu, Hawaii, where the four Kumaras in the third canto have approached Vaikuntha. They've decided to visit Vaikuntha. Even though they're Atmaramas, they don't really need anything, but somehow or other, they got a desire to visit Vaikuntha. And then they had this confrontation with these two doorkeepers, Jaya and Vijaya, on the innermost gate to Vaikuntha. And it became contentious because the gatekeepers kept them out. But because of this confrontation with the gatekeepers, Lord Narayan himself came on his own 2 feet with his entourage, including the goddess of fortune, his Swarupa Shakti, to completely blow the Kumara's minds by letting them see him and Lakshmi Devi face to face. Dhruva Maharaj saw the Lord face to face. At the end of the Bhagavatam, Uddhava spends considerable time hearing instruction from the Lord. And so we see how the Bhagavatam, just hearing the Bhagavatam helps us also, brings us to the point where we may see the Lord, eventually see the Lord face to face and engage in his devotional service, which is the cure for all our ills, as we see at the end of the Rasa Panchajayi, the 5 chapters on the Rasa dance in the 10th canto, where King Pariksit, just so that, because he has a quite varied audience on the bank of the river. It's not all pure devotees, all kinds of sages with all sorts of practices and all sorts of different goals have come, because this is a huge, huge event. And so King Pariksit recognizes the variety among the audience. So in order that people, the audience may not misunderstand the rasa dance, he wants, he asks a question that gives Shukadev Goswami the opportunity to clarify the power of hearing these pastimes of the Lord. So he asks him, well, how are we to understand that the emblem of Dharma, the bridge to the ultimate Dharma, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is acting adharmically, acting against Dharma, by spending the evening with all these ladies, many of whom are married to others. And Shukadev Goswami says, here's what you need to understand. These pastimes of Vishnu, and he refers to Vikriditam hi Vishnu, he says, these pastimes of Vishnu. Why Vishnu? Because Vishnu is all pervading. And in the rasa dance, we see Krishna is all pervading. He's dancing individually with each and every one of the millions of gopis who attend the rasa dance. So he says these pastimes of Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, just remember who we're talking about here, are so purifying that they rip out the hridrogam, the heart disease that afflicts us all, and that is lust or selfishness. And so that's addressed right here in the second verse, the Vastu Nirdesha shloka of Srimad-Bhagavatam. Dharma prodchita kaitavata. So we hear so often from our Swami, Swami Tripurari, Guru Maharaj, how the Bhagavatam, the last word of the Bhagavatam is Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Praja. Sarva Dharman Parityaj, all conventional, all the kinds of dharma that we've been talking about for the last 600 odd verses, hour and change, however long the conversation took. He says, Parityaja, completely reject them, kick them out, completely. Parityaja, not just tyaja, not just reject them, but parityaja, completely reject them, and take shelter in me exclusively. Find your shelter in me without any other distraction. And then our acharyas point out that the Bhagavatam picks up at the next step. Dharma prodcheta kartavatra paramo nirmatsaram. He says, now for those who have already rejected all conventional ideas of Dharma, which are referred to in this verse as kaitava dharma. Dharma prodchita kaitavatra. So completely, for those who have already completely rejected kaitava dharma, the sarva dharma that Krishna refers to at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, now we've got something to talk about. So he tells us, the Bhagavatam itself tells us in this verse, who is the most suitable audience for the Bhagavatam? Those who have completely rejected kaitava dharma. And what do we mean by kaitava dharma? Well, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami makes it extremely plain in the 22nd chapter of Madhya Lila. This is the chapter where the 64 angas of sadhana bhakti are discussed, but actually much is discussed before Lord Chaitanya, in his conversation with Sanatana Goswami, actually gets to the 64 angles of sadhana bhakti. He talks about Shraddha, but he also talks about, who is qualified for this. So he says, he talks, he cite when he discusses this particular verse, the second verse of the Bhagavatam, he tells us straight out, Kaitava Dharma means Dharma Artha Kama Moksha Vancha. Dharma Artha Kama Moksha Vancha. It means anything done with a desire for gaining personal virtue so that we can get ahead in the world, dharma, virtue, artha, material progress. And why do we want to progress materially? So that we can enjoy more. And when we become frustrated with that, we may want release. We may want cessation of suffering. We may want liberation. And so these are all counted as selfish dharma. These are the four purusharthas. These are the four great values of human life. These are the things that everybody in the world is working for. Virtue, material progress, pleasure, and maybe among some liberation, some kind of salvation, something like that. Why does the Bhagavatam call them Kaitava Dharma? Because they're about me. Because they're selfish. Because the focus there is my virtue, my progress, my pleasure, my release. So the Bhagavatam tells us right from the get-go, right out of the gate, this is a text for those who've already given that up. And because they've given that up, they are completely pure at heart. They are satam. And how do we know they're satam? Because they are nirmatsaranam. They don't have any selfish desires. They're completely free of envy because they're completely free of selfish desires. That's the best audience for the Bhagavatam. Although we will see Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada will also tell us that there's considerable benefit for everyone else. So Srila Prabhupada opens his purport by talking about these four purusharthas. He says, religion includes four primary subjects, namely pious activities, economic development, satisfaction of the senses, and finally, liberation from material bondage. Irreligious life is a barbarous condition. It's just animal life, he says. And the hallmark of material life is competition. Competition for enjoying some, in one way or another, some subtle way or some gross way. So Prabhupada writes in his purport, this is a paragraph that is particularly striking, and I cannot talk about this verse without coming to one sentence in the third paragraph of this text to this verse. So he writes, in the Vedas, the above mentioned four activities are prescribed in the regulative way, so that there will not be any undue competition for sense gratification. But Srimad-Bhagavatam is transcendental to all these sense gratificatory activities. It is purely transcendental literature, which can be understood only by the pure devotees of the Lord, who are transcendental to competitive sense gratification. In the material world, there is keen competition between animal and animal, man and man, community and community, nation and nation. But the devotees of the Lord rise above such competitions. They do not compete with the materialists because they are on the path back to Godhead, where life is eternal and blissful. Such transcendentalists are non-envious and pure in heart. So here he's simply echoing the assertion of the verse. And so he's telling us, this is who the Bhagavatam is for. These are the people who will be most able to appreciate the message of the Bhagavatam. Such transcendentalists are non-envious and pure in heart. In the material world, everyone is envious of everyone else, and therefore there is competition. But the transcendental devotees of the Lord are not only free from material envy, but are well-wishers to everyone, and they strive to establish a competition-less society with God at the center. That last sentence, it changed my life the very first time I read it. I had already been kind of turned by the association of devotees, by chanting, by studying the Bhagavad Gita. But when I started, probably at the end of 1969, to read Srimad-Bhagavatam, and back then, all we had of the Bhagavatam was the first canto in 3 volumes, as we know. I read this part of this paragraph, and I got to the sentence where he says, everyone is envious of everyone else, and therefore there is competition. But the transcendental devotees of the Lord are not only free from material envy, but are well-wishers to everyone, and they strive to establish a competitionless society with God in the center. This completely blew my mind. I was already inclined to bhakti yoga. I was already engaged in bhakti yoga. But I didn't feel that I had any commitment. I think I might have been associating thickly with devotees at the time. And I had great regard for Srila Prabhupada, who became my eternal beloved spiritual master. Became my eternal spiritual master is a little strange sounding, but I realized that was his position in my life. But that didn't really start to happen until I read this sentence. My life changed even more when I read this sentence, because this was 1969 or maybe January of 1970. And when I read this sentence, I realized one thing very powerfully, that now I have found the revolution that we had all been looking for in the 60s, that this was it. And this was, the more I read Srimad-Bhagavatam, the more powerfully this was confirmed. By the time I got to the end of the first canto of the Bhagavatam, where we read about the introduction of the beginning of the age of Kali and the nature of the Kali Yuga and the cure for Kali Yuga. By that time, I was the hook had been set, and there was no way I could get away. I was already haunted by rasa. And how do I know that I couldn't get away? I actually tried a couple of times that first year. I left the temple 3 times, once for a couple of days, once for a couple of weeks, and once I think it turned out to be for maybe a month and a half or 2 months. But I couldn't stay away from Krishna consciousness. I never stopped chanting my japa, no matter what else I was doing. And I couldn't stay away from the association of devotees. And this sentence, where Srila Prabhupada says, the transcendental devotees of the Lord are not only free from material envy, but are well-wishers to everyone. And they strive to establish a competition-less society with God at the center. I just realized this was it. This is the revolution that we're looking for. And I need to be part of this revolution. And I had some kind of like picture of myself in the basement of a temple. We had a basement in our temple here. In the basement of the temple, wearing a dhoti. And I think I had a picture of myself with a flannel shirt, because revolutionaries wore flannel shirts, or maybe blue chambray shirts with the sleeves rolled up, long sleeves with the sleeves rolled up, maybe working at a printing press or a mimeograph machine or something, like getting out the message of the Bhagavatam somehow or other, just working to effect this revolution, to bring about this revolution. So this is one of my very favorite verses of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So Srila Prabhupada and especially makes it really clear that the Bhagavatam goes beyond even the idea of impersonal liberation, completely transcends even that. And it's especially for those who are completely pure in heart. But it also lends itself well to those who are becoming pure in heart. It hastens that purification. And so this becomes the proper medicine for the conditioned soul to take to address that hridroga, that heart disease, the selfishness that creates conflict between each of us, among all of us. One time when Srila Prabhupada was here in Honolulu, this was in May of 1972, and he came to install our deity, Sri Sri Panchatattva. We arranged a program for him at an auditorium, large auditorium at the University of Hawaii, the Kennedy Theater at the University of Hawaii. And he was talking about a Krishna conscious society as a society that would be free from conflict. And he used the image of stones and a pond. So if we have a pond with a very nice, calm surface, we drop a stone in that pond, ripples will generate, radiate from that point where the stone was dropped in the pond. So there will be ripples that radiate from that point. And if we drop another stone, ripples will radiate from that point. But when the ripples meet each other, they cause a kind of chaotic thing. It's not a very harmonious situation. And the more stones we drop, the more chaotic the surface of that pond becomes. However, if we pick one point and we may drop as many stones as we like in that on that one point on the surface of that pond, and what we will get is a very beautiful, harmonious pattern of concentric circles radiating out from the point where those stones are being dropped. Very peaceful. There used to be an app, for smartphones, I guess, where it was like a little Japanese pond with smooth round stones in the bottom. And if you touch the screen of your phone, you could make ripples on the surface of this virtual pond. So Srila Prabhupada used this image, and I got an idea, which I never followed through on, actually for a Bhagavad Gita article, using this image to show what a kind of an Ishavasya society, a Krishna-centric, God-centric society could be like. Maybe something that I have to write before this old rig is thrown on the junk heap. But so this is a very this is unique. And how to take this medicine, we're going to find out a little bit more. Well, we're going to find out considerably more about that next week. But Srila Prabhupada writes in his purport, the proper method for receiving this transcendental message is to hear it submissively. A challenging attitude cannot help us realize this transcendental message. One particular word is used herein for proper guidance. The word is sushrushu. Sushrushu. One must be anxious to hear this transcendental message. That sincerity to hear is the first qualification. So if our hearts are even just pure enough that we have some desire to open-mindedly, open-heartedly, even more to the point, hear this message of Srimad-Bhagavatam, then it will have a great benefit, even from the very beginning. And then in his commentary on this verse, which is quite wonderful, I recommend it all. And I once again need to point out that the best I can hope to do in this little series, this month's February series on the auspicious invocation, the Mangalacarana of the Srimad-Bhagavatam, is to sharpen the audience's taste for hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam, for hearing and studying these three verses, and Srila Prabhupada's purport and the commentaries, especially Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentaries on these verses. This is I'm just bringing out a trailer here. These verses, these three verses are so rich that we could speak on them at great length. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out that through the hearing process, the submissive hearing, the Bhagavatam, which is most auspicious, the Lord, the shelter of all, Sri Krishna, is immediately brought under control and captured in the heart. So here we see at the end of the verse, as soon as one attentively and submissively hears the message of Bhagavatam, by this culture of knowledge, the Supreme Lord is established within the heart. But Vishwanath Chakravarti makes the image even more stark, that the Lord becomes captured in the devotee's heart. So why would he say that? He says, this indicates that prema will arise in the devotees, since the Lord is brought under control only by prema. But hearing the Bhagavatam is enough to establish in our hearts that Krishna prema, which will capture the Lord in our hearts. And then he cites a verse from the 11th canto. Pranaya rasanaya dritangri padmaha. The Lord's lotus feet are tied by ropes to the devotee. This is such a wonderful verse. This is, now I can't remember. I haven't memorized the chart that Sakyarati and Shamananda made for me yet. I have to print one out and just like put it everywhere in my hut so that wherever I go, I'm going to see it until it's etched into my memory. This is such a powerful process that Krishna becomes captured and bound in the devotees' hearts by ropes of love, as the sage describes it to King Nevi. I think it might be hubby or cubby, but I would have to look again. So this is such a powerful spiritual process. And this verse further distinguishes the Bhagavad Purana from every other text. Because all the other texts that we see, all the other spiritual texts, which as we saw last week, Narada Muni refers to as, by comparison to the Bhagavatam, jugupsitam, or detestable. Because they don't focus exclusively on devotional service to Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Only in that sense are they detestable, because they miss that point. So hearing the Bhagavatam is such a powerful process of bhakti yoga that when Srila Rupa Goswami discusses these 64 angas of sadhana bhakti in the second chapter of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he actually repeats 5 of them at the end, 5 that had already been discussed, and says that these 5 items. So I don't remember how they're given in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. I do remember how they're given in this section of chapter 22 of Madhya Lila of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Sadhu Sangha Nama Kirtan Bhagavat Shravan Mathuravas Srimurtira Shraddhaya Sevana. So Sadhu Sangha, associating with devotees, and Rupa Goswami. I like to remind myself and my audiences of this as often as I can. When he discusses Sadhu Sangha at the end of that, toward the end of that section of the second chapter, he says there are 3 qualifications for Sadhu Sangha, 3 qualities in the sadhus with whom we want to associate. And one is Swajatiyasya. They're part of our group. Jata has to do with kind or birth, class. So in other words, they share our spiritual goals, at least broadly. Worship, service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna. Sajatiya Shaye, sometimes devotees like to characterize Sajatiya as being like-minded. I prefer to say like-hearted, because I think like-hearted is even more to the point. Our hearts are they all have the same aim. Snigdhe, affectionately disposed toward us. If they're affectionately inclined toward us, that makes them good association. And svatovare. Svata has to do with ourself, and vara means superior, better. So they're more advanced than we are. So we want to associate with devotees who share our spiritual aspirations, who are affectionately disposed toward us, and who are more advanced than we are, because they will pull us along. So then Rupa Goswami says, these last 5 items have inconceivable and astonishing. I better go through the whole list again. So Sadhu Sangha, Nama Kirtan, chanting the holy names, either in Kirtan or meditatively in Japa, although we also have some meditative Kirtans. There's one devotee with whom I share a very strong affinity for one particular Kirtan by one of my godbrothers. And because it it's entrancing. It's actually entrancing. It's at a certain point, it can we get, it's real easy to get immersed, just completely lost in this Kirtan. So Nam Kirtan, Bhagavat Shravan, hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam, hearing about Bhagavan, but especially hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam. Mathura Vas, spending time in a holy place like Mathura, Vrindavan, Jagannath Puri, Shri Kshetra, and Mayapur, but also in places that have been turned into like replicas of the spiritual world. So we have places like Audarya Madhuvan, where the Lord is the focus of all the activities, and you feel this atmosphere. My friend Turiyadas, pretty much my Vartma Pradarshaka guru, the devotee who actually showed me Bhagavad Gita, actually the first devotee who was bold enough to see me chanting on the other side of the street, come over to the other side of the street and invite me to the feast at the park the next day, and to show me Bhagavad Gita and to kind of introduce me, to draw me into the practice of Bhakti Yoga. He used to have an ashram on Maui, the island of Maui, called Sri Vrindavan Gardens, and he had Radha Kund, he had Shama Kund, he had Govinda Kund. He had created this little Vrindavan on Maui, and you could feel that. And we feel that same power when we all visit Madhuvan. And the more sadhus who are visiting Madhuvan, the more powerfully we feel that when we're there. And then Shri Murtira Shraddhaya Sevana, worshiping the deity with love, with Shraddha, with faith, with our hearts. So these are particularly powerful. And so he says, Vishwanath Chakravarti says, the Lord becoming captured by the mind, becoming captured in the heart, cannot leave. And then he says, and if the two words sadhya and kritibi are taken together, then it means that Krishna is brought under control immediately for those who are accomplished or qualified, whereas it happens after a slight delay for those who are not so qualified. But those, both types of persons, the accomplished and the unaccomplished, are qualified for hearing Bhagavatam. And then he cites the next verse, which we'll talk about next week, how we should hear Srimad-Bhagavatam. And a little later, he says, in this work, what is the recommended action that we need to undertake? What does this work tell us to do? And this recalls for me a conversation I had when I was actually a little boy. When I was young, I lived in a little town on the central coast of California that my great-great-grandfather had been one of the founders of this town. He was actually the engineer who laid out the streets. He surveyed the valley and laid out the streets for this town of Lompoc. So we were from a rather prominent family in this very small town. Back then, I think we had maybe 6,000 people living in Lompoc. It's much bigger now, as are most towns. But so we went to church every week. Now, my father was an agnostic. My father probably became an agnostic when he was 18, when he was in the Navy, stationed here at Pearl Harbor as a photographer, documenting the recovery efforts after the attack, just a couple of months before. And that pretty much, he was an 18-year-old boy 18-year-old young man who had grown up on a farm. It was mainly an agricultural area when my dad was growing up. My grandfather grew vegetables, raised sheep, but he also owned a dairy. My father spent most of his boyhood working in that dairy somehow or other, getting up early in the morning to wash bottles and help milk cows and all those sorts of things. So anyway, when he was taking photos and movies of them taking the bodies of other 18, 19, 20-year-old farm boys out of the wrecks of these warships, that kind of did it for him and God. But because we were from a prominent family, we went to church every Sunday. I went to Sunday school, and our minister would come over to our home fairly regularly. So when I was little, the minister's name was Mr. McGee, and I remember one evening after dinner, we were sitting in the living room, and I was sitting on the couch with Reverend McGee, and I had two questions for him. Now, I was 6 or 7 years old. I cannot tell you where these questions came from, except there seemed to be an indication that I've always had an interest in spiritual life. It's always been a big driver for me. Spiritual life and sense gratification, two things that just go great together. Which explains why I was probably a little mad as a teenager, as so many of us were. But I had two questions for Reverend McGee. The first was, what is God like? And the second was, what are we supposed to do? Why are we here? He didn't have answers for either of those questions. I never met anyone who had answers to those questions until I began reading Srimad-Bhagavatam. And this verse of the Bhagavatam tells us why you're not going to find that anywhere else. Oh, now I have a counterpoint to that story. Oh, it's already 7:20. I have a counterpoint to that story, lest people think I might have been too spiritually precocious as a 6 or 7-year-old boy. Another time when Reverend McGee came over to our house, although we generally, I think we regularly said a prayer over our meal in the evening, we usually just referred to it as the prayer. And I was also often asked to say the prayer over dinner. But it was always asked of me, Billy, would you like to say the prayer? And but this night, I think my parents wanted to show off and show me off, maybe, I don't know. And so they asked, Billy, would you like to say grace? Now, I had never heard it referred to before like that, saying grace, invoking God's grace on our partaking of this particular meal. Billy, would you like to say grace? And everybody bowed their heads. And as I remembered, I was a little confused. I think I had a sense that we were supposed to say the prayer, but I also just really, really wasn't sure. And there's also a little bit of goofball in my character, and was there even then. So everyone had their heads bowed very solemnly. And I very solemnly said the word grace. And Reverend McGee started laughing so hard that he almost fell out of his chair. So lest you think that I was too spiritually precocious, that I was some sort of, I don't know, avatar or something like that, I also caused a bit of an uproar just saying grace over the meal once. So what action should be undertaken? Well, it vehemently rejects prajita, that path which cheats, which deceives a person, which distracts us from our real goal. So in other words, sakama karma is rejected. He says, but then he says, the prefix pra completely indicates that the path promising liberation is also rejected. So everything else is rejected. Here we see the distinction again between the Bhagavatam and everything else, every other scripture, even every other Vedic scripture, including all the Puranas. We see that distinction drawn with very bright line. And that is, it gives parodharma. That is a pure devotional service, causeless, unmotivated, and unceasing devotional service as the real activity of human life. So then this leads us to a verse in the next chapter of the Bhagavatam. Savai pungsang parodharmo yato bhaktir adhokshaje ahaitukya pratihata yayatma suprasidati. That the supreme occupation for all humanity, which will actually give us the goal of life, is devotional service to Krishna. And devotional service, because it's ahaituki, it doesn't have any cause other than itself. The Bhagavatam itself tells us later in the 11th canto, I believe, bhaktya sanjataya bhaktya. Bhaktya is generated from bhakti. And so that means, first of all, we get bhakti from the hearts of those bhaktas who share their bhakti with others. The Madhyamya bhaktas, as Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains at the very beginning of his Madhurya Kadambini, which traces how progressive devotional service looks and how it works through the 9 different stages that Rupa Goswami suggests in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So bhaktya sanjataya bhaktya, we get bhakti from the bhaktas, and we get sadhana bhakti from the bhaktas, from those devotees who are willing to share their bhakti with us, especially the guru, the shiksha gurus and the diksha guru. And that sadhana bhakti yields bhava bhakti, which gives prema bhakti. So in the 5th chapter, we see Narada Muni instructing Vyasadeva that, again, to draw the distinction between the Bhagavatam and everything else, between bhakti yoga and every other thing, including every other kind of yoga, is that whereas you have to engage in the other yogas practically perfectly in every way to achieve the desired results, and then the results are temporary. But bhakti yoga is not like that. Bhakti yoga is completely different. There is never any loss, as Krishna says in the Gita. And as Narada Muni says, that even if we completely blow it, even if we engage, even if we fall away from our spiritual practice, because either of poor determination, as Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur characterizes it, or bad association, as Srila Prabhupada characterizes it, nothing is ever lost, because our heart becomes rasagraha, or haunted by rasa. And this is another article that I have to write. I've begun this article, but I haven't gotten very far on it yet. That Vishwanath Chakravarti points out that this haunting by rasa begins from the very first day of worshiping the Lord. And he makes a really nice argument for that. which Jiva Goswami confirms even a little bit more elaborately in his Bhakti Sandarbha. So this is hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam is so powerful that it brings us directly to the lotus feet of the Lord. We begin the first two cantos at the two beautiful lotus feet of the Lord. And then we're gradually drawn up to the Lord's smiling face and left with his intelligence at the end of the 11th and 12th cantos of the Bhagavatam. There is nothing like Srimad-Bhagavatam anywhere. No literature like it, nothing in the world that's at all like Srimad-Bhagavatam. Hearing Bhagavatam has such power that anyone who hears it all attentively will eventually be will find themselves immersed in pure love for Krishna. Okay, so I'll stop here. There's so much to say about this verse, and the hard part, the exciting and terrifying part, exciting and at once terrifying part of trying to discuss this verse is just trying to discern what can I say in 45 or 50 minutes about this particular verse of the Bhagavatam. So I made a little attempt, and I'll turn off the sharing and open the forum up for any discussion, comments, questions, or anything about this wonderful verse of Srimad Bhagavatam.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Maharaj.
Krishna Kumari, I cannot hear you.
Oh, okay.
You have to go on the English channel, Krishna Kumari.
Oh, okay. Let's see. English channel. Chat. English. Okay, Hare Krishna?
Nope, not yet.
No? Oh, shoot. Okay. Hare Krishna, no?
Oh.
Sorry, I don't know.
Maharaj, if you unmute the original audio, you might be able to hear.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Thank you. Okay, try again.
Okay, Hare Krishna.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay.
I don't know. Now, can
Sorry.
everyone else hear the question, or will I need to, or the comment or question, will I need to repeat it?
I'm not sure if Anangaman, she said thumbs up, so everyone can hear her.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Gotcha.
I hope it's worth hearing after all of that. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you for a beautiful class, and I really liked your story when you were a little boy of saying grace very literally, and that was really nice. But what struck me at the beginning of your classes, when I've been was an educator for 30 years, and whenever I introduced material to my students, I would go through this very same process of like setting a purpose for our reading, which is exactly what the Mangalacarana does before we begin the work. And so it just really struck me how, we're activating our prior knowledge. What do we know about like the threefold miseries? Even what do we know about the Vyasadeva? Who is he? So it's this process of how to read for comprehension, getting the proper mindset and being open to engaging in the reading. And that just really struck me, how it's expert teaching when you go through these processes, and how every time, and I haven't done this before, but doing Mangalacharya prayers before reading anything, any scriptures, really gets us ready to be open and hearing what Krishna is trying to say to us, what Srila Prabhupada is trying to say to us. And I just made me think about Krishna as the ultimate teacher, the highest, the expert, distinguished teacher. So that just really made an impression on me, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, and I was also an educator for 30 some years. I taught in Gurukulas, and then later I taught college English for maybe 25 years or so. And one of the things that, especially when we're approaching a nonfiction prose text, is you want to get a sense of who the author is, what the point is the author wants to make, and who the author's audience. The author certainly needs to understand who his or her audience is as well. And and I guess the Bhagavatam is a good example. It made it real easy for me to do that, but it's probably a habit that it's sometimes we would say when you, especially a nonfiction prose text, look at the table of contents, read the first beginning and end of each of the chapters or something. Maybe look at the index so that you have a kind of a framework to hang what you're going to be reading. Hang the details as you read the book on. Creates expectations.
Yeah.
That should become satisfied as we go through the text. So yeah.
Well, it even tells us how to read it, with attention, with
Exactly.
focus. And so I just think we can't ignore all of these steps that are put in place for us, and have this be a part of what we do every time when we're reading scripture, and to really get everything out of it that we can get out of it. And I'm taking ourselves through that process. So anyway, thank you so much again. I appreciate your
thank
time.
I particularly appreciate your saying that even when we sit down to read, it's good to say the Mangalacarana, because it helps us focus our minds, helps us focus our hearts on the Bhagavatam. And I'm working with a small group of devotees here at the Honolulu Center, uninitiated devotees, actually, new devotees, preparing them to give Bhagavad Gita classes in the evening, because they're young. I'm old, and they're young, and I would like to. I'm interested in the future of this project, and I see them as the future. These are smart, sincere, young devotees, and we've been having what we call practice classes. We haven't gotten to the stage yet where they're comfortable enough to give what they would consider a practice Gita class. So we're just kind of like letting them find a voice. But they have found that before we even start our little project, which we do 3 times a week, that they like to read those, the Mangalacarana that Srila Prabhupada has at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita as it is, before they even begin, because it sets the right tone, sets the right mood. It's really nice.
Okay.
Sharda had a question. The sincere absorption of the Bhagavatam ultimately allows us to overcome the repeated birth and death. Yes, this is the threefold miseries, and certainly include repeated birth and death. Sounds like an adhyatmika klesha, a self-generated problem, whether you see the body as the body, the mind, or the intelligence, or whatever, as the self. And it certainly does that. It completely as this verse says, completely uproots those threefold miseries. So the hearing Bhagavatam attentively and submissively, hearing as Sharada characterizes it here, sincerely, immersing ourselves with some sincerity in hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam, will certainly bring about the effect of overcoming repeated birth and death. I hope that helps. Is there anything else? Okay, so I'll take this opportunity to excuse myself then, since I hear the kirtan over at the temple calling me, and I have to go give another Srimad-Bhagavatam class. I get to go give another Srimad-Bhagavatam class. So talk about in total immersion. This is not the sprinkling baptism. This is total immersion baptism that I get from these sessions. And I want to thank you all so much for your company. Oh, now I see Nam Rasan, my old friend, my dear friend. I want to thank you, especially Padmanabha Maharaj for engaging me like this, and Sakyarati and Shamananda for facilitating it for this old technology befuddled character, for Grandpa, and all of you for giving me someone to actually talk to, so I'm not just talking to my screen. And we'll see you again next week for the conclusion of this series, where wear your drinking hats. What are those hats with the beer cans on them or something like that, and the hose, you know, because next week we will hear the Bhagavatam implore us to go ahead and just get plastered, but on something much sweeter, with no hangover whatsoever. Thank you again so much. Hare Krishna. We'll see you next Friday.
Sripad Bhakti Abhay Ashram Maharaj ki
Jai.
jai.
Gaur Bhakti